All right. Hey, folks. Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Today, I am going to share a conversation I had a couple days ago with my dear friend and integral sister, Diane Musho Hamilton. And Diane and I have been tilling the integral fields together for a dozen or so years. And we've done many events together, Integral Living Room, Integral Spiritual Experience, many of the Integral Institute seminars. And she is a real treat, and this conversation was a lot of fun. Diane is by conventional profession a mediator and has worked for many years in the court system of Utah. She is a lineage holder in the Soto Zen tradition and was ordained as a Zen priest in 2003. She is currently the lead teacher at Two Arrows Zen, based in Salt Lake City. And she is the author of the books Everything is Workable, A Zen Approach to Conflict Resolution, and The Zen of You and Me. In the last few years, she has focused her attention with a very cool team of people on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think has had a fruitful time with it. So, welcome again. Thank you, especially for those of you who are joining us live here on Integral Live. And here is my conversation with Diane Musho Hamilton. You have been, in the last several years, right, been doing workshops with your team on this. And you are now off the road, I'm thinking, and working on a book.
That's correct.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so just fill us in.
All right. I started doing work with diversity, what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion these days, really back in the 90s when I was working as a mediator. Even though it wasn't, you know, these what you and I would call these pluralistic values were not necessarily in the mainstream at that time. You didn't hear people talk about race as much on the news in the way we do now.
Right.
The feminist movement, of course, flowered in the 70s and then kind of died back a little bit. So in the 90s, we weren't hearing a lot about it. But right now, we're experiencing another enormous bloom.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think you, in your book, I was just reading the first part of that you sent me. I think you describe it well when you talk about moving into, first of all, I have to say, starting your book with the Big Bang. I want every book to start with the Big Bang. I mean, it's really true. Yeah, it's great. And you take us through evolution to our time.
Yes.
And you do it beautifully in 3 or 4 pages. And one of the distinctions you make is that, you know, civil rights and feminism are, in terms of the exteriors, in terms of the laws, you know, pretty much handled.
Right.
And that was the movement that happened in modernity.
Right.
And that, you know, really flourished in the 60s and 70s. Civil rights, feminism, both. And now we're in a green sensibility that wants to work on these issues in the interiors.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I thought that was very, very true.
Well, I have a very good teacher, as do you. So, of course, Ken Wilber is who who
Right.
taught me to see through this lens. It's been very helpful in my work, as I know it has been in your work and in your thinking, to really begin to look at all of this through a developmental lens. And when we look through a developmental lens, that of course leads us to looking through an evolutionary lens, because basically things are changing and evolving over time. So the kind of conversation that was being had in the 60s that was about civil rights, and I always love to think about Martin Luther King's speech where he, in third person, challenges America to deliver on its promise to Black people and people of color. And then he kind of reminds the we space of the civil rights movement how they need to conduct themselves so that they can maintain the moral high ground. And then he finally finishes in first person with his I have a dream. And he's so connected to himself and so passionate that basically he brings the entire audience with him into his vision. It's a really elegant use of third, second, and first person. But basically what people in the States and in within the communities of color is that, yeah, we passed all the right laws, but in the same way that it still takes time, we won the Civil War, got rid of slavery, and it still took decades to start to address Jim Crow. These things happen, in an evolutionary fashion. And so bringing the subjective experience of people of color or gender diverse people or women or people with disabilities, marginalized groups, bringing their actual experience forward and then continuing to advocate for a real place at the table. So even though the laws have been enacted, there's still all kinds of implicit bias that makes our systems and our structures continue to be biased. And so that's part of the big challenge. So it has to be in the exteriors, and now it also has to be in the interiors.
Right. And we can see that in cultural evolution is happening in real time. It's like a booster rocket. If you think that Me Too was less than 2 years ago with the Harvey Weinstein thing and the Oscars there's
and Tucker Carlson not apologizing for his terribly misogynist statements.
What'd he say?
He doesn't apologize. He just basically says they're showing recordings of him from a few years back where he's pretty denigrating to women, and
is he?
He's taking that the far right stand that he doesn't have to apologize.
Yeah. Well, if we look at the developmental landscape, that's what we are dealing with, and one of the great things about integral theory and an evolutionary view is that we don't necessarily have to think this shouldn't be happening. That we've done something terribly wrong and we're in this position and things are getting worse.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that. And everybody's fighting for their lives for the, on the right, the Tucker Carlson position of what more do you people want? What more do you people want? You got this, got that. And then the people on the left side who they want to be fully seen. They want the karmas of their lives to be in the field fully.
Yes, that's right.
And then there's the rest of us that are kind of trying to hide.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But that is the move forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've heard Ken speaking about this recently and talking about how we have at least 3 very solid developmental levels involved in the culture wars. So we have the traditional level, of course, in which black and white is really important, and everybody stays inside the line, inside their own group, and they don't change their gender identity, and they don't do any of that.
Everybody knows who they are. They know
right.
who each other is. And can we just pause for a moment and say, there's something about that is very comfortable.
Absolutely. Loyalty, duty, self-sacrifice, obedience, knowing who's coming to your wedding and your funeral and not having your best friend call and say, I'm not feeling like it. It's fantastic. Traditional values are, the heartland. They're the stability of culture.
But what we can also see developmentally is that when that worldview or that developmental stage is in charge, there's a lot of people who are outside.
Absolutely, because you don't
outside of the circle.
You don't fit into those categories. And you and I have often talked about how, in our perspective, that shadow often drives development. So if you're gay in a traditional culture and it's tremendously homophobic and oppressive and you're subjected to conversion therapy, you might actually transition literally out of traditional precisely because of its intolerance, or because you see hypocrisy within the traditional culture, like let's say around sexuality in the Catholic Church right now, or the Buddhist world, that, you know, all these really tried and true dependable values are actually not the case, that people are doing all kinds of shadowy things in the background. And that hypocrisy might actually force you to leave. It might be that you just look over into the next valley and see some people doing things differently and get interested by it. But all of that leads to moving into another level. So we have the traditional level, and then we have the secular materialist scientific level, in which, and we see that all around, you know, in terms of being self-made and merit-based systems and everything being measured empirically, and, you know,
the modern stage. I love what you put here. Again, a line I underlined. You said, we looked under the hood of meritocratic objective fairness and realized that it still disadvantaged people along many lines, including those of race and gender. Absolutely. That's why after, you know, that's what's so beautiful. Our system is born of those beautiful, objective, empiric values. Yeah. And you know, when I was working for the court system and we were exploring racial and ethnic fairness, you know, basically, if you ask anybody in the system, any employee in the system, all the way from, you know, police officers through prosecutors to judges to, you know, parole officers, everybody within the system says that they're striving to be fair. And yet, a statistical analysis shows us, again, that at every point in the system, in criminal justice, when you have discretion, which there's a lot of discretion, that people of color come out treated more harshly. They're overrepresented in prisons, they're overrepresented in convictions, they're overrepresented in harsh sentencing. I mean, that's part of why there's such an outcry over Paul Manafort right now. He was guilty of stealing something like $50 million, and literally, if he were a black man, he would have gotten 20 years for stealing a stack of quarters. So basically, then what we see is that even though we espouse those values and those laws are written down, that, you know, these implicit biases are at work and people can't see them, and that's the biggest problem. There's a really good book that was on the New York Times bestseller list called Blind Spot, that if your audience is interested in, really goes into the problem of implicit bias and how much we see how biased we are when we look at these statistical results, but when we ask ourselves if we're biased, we literally can't see it. Mm-hmm. So then hence comes green, right? So we have traditional values, we have meritocracy, and which is the modern stage, which is orange developmental level.
Yes, which we love because people are, as they like to say, bringing it or crushing it.
Yeah, well, we don't want to get rid of meritocratic fairness.
No, we absolutely
want to enlarge it.
Yes.
Because it started small.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, but it is growing but not fast enough for green. And hallelujah.
Hallelujah. So then along comes what I guess Don Beck or Claire Graves calls the sensitive self or relativism. And then we have these values, which in our culture are in Boulder, Colorado. You're living in the Mecca, one of the Meccas of pluralism, along with the Bay Area and possibly New York City and Sedona, Arizona, you know, right. Small pockets. But you know, there's real traction right now. The difference I notice is that these values at pluralism, values of inclusion, values of diversity, values of supporting minority voices, and kind of an anti-aggression, anti-triggering, microaggression, you know, in gentle compassion values are really beautiful, but they basically backfire when there's an overabundance of them, so that they become the most aggressive. There's the most aggressive sensitivity to microaggressions, and there's the most intolerant espousing of tolerance, and there's the most exclusive value of inclusion, to where green culture has ironically coined the term cancel culture, which means that not only will I not include you, I will cancel you out of my existence. So if you're Louis C.K. and I don't like that you're a creep, or that you're creepy with your sexuality, I'm just going to cancel you. I'm going to cancel you, Michael Jackson, because, you know, apparently you have a history of pedophilia. So I'm just going to X you out of my world. And they do it to people online, and they do it to people in comedy clubs, and they do it all over the place. So inclusion becomes cancel. Isn't that wild?
It is. And, you know, I think we can make a distinction that I'm free to cancel anybody I want out of my world.
Yes.
But I don't want to, I can't cancel people out of your world.
No, you can't cancel people out of my world.
And I can't cancel people out of the world.
And what I would prefer then is that you not preach to me about inclusion while you're canceling.
Right.
Cancel away. I'm all about canceling, believe me, but I'm not about
But here we go, Di. So Bill Maher the other night, he's saying, okay, so do we have to stop listening to Michael Jackson?
Is this Bill Maher?
Yeah, Bill Maher. Okay. And he makes a distinction. He says, I'm not going to stop listening to Michael Jackson. But he says, I don't think I'm going to be able to listen to Pretty Young Thing anymore.
Fair enough.
You know, so, you know, we actually get to cancel all kinds of things. That's part of being free, you know.
Well, that's called balancing inclusion and exclusion, and not being confused about the fact that we can be utterly inclusive. Of course, from the perspective of enlightenment, all things are already included. Of course, from the perspective of tremendous generosity and also values of fairness, everybody should have a voice at the table. Absolutely. But there are certain times where I have certain people at the table, I'm never going to get anything done. And I actually want to get it done. So, you know, like there are actually limits on inclusion from other points of view.
Right.
And Michael Jackson, I mean, my argument with Michael Jackson would be, first of all, I think there's a deeper conversation about how to prevent child sexual abuse, because we do know that it's very injurious to people. And Michael Jackson apparently, you know, I mean, he did go through due process, and he was acquitted, although I guess he settled that lawsuit for $23 million. These people on this documentary claim that they just simply weren't prepared to face that then, and they are now, so fair enough. But you can't really cancel someone whose influence in culture, at least in relationship to music, is so profound that everybody from Beyonce to Bruno Mars is somehow influenced by him. Mm-hmm. Like, that's just not a possibility.
Right.
You know,
who was it on I think it was on the Bill Maher show again, somebody pointed out Michelangelo loved his 12-year-old boys.
Yes.
You know, so the Mona Lisa, the Pieta, you know. So, I mean,
it's complex.
It is.
But these three levels are at war with each other. That's our point.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right. And we can also, as developmentalists, look and see the progress. I mean, the fact that we're now sort of having this conversation about Michael Jackson, all right, so maybe it's 25 years too late, or, you know, too late for the justice in real time, but we're catching up.
Yeah.
You know, we're getting there, and it's not supposed to be pretty. Evolution isn't pretty.
Mm-mm.
You know.
No, I think you taught me that line. It's beautiful, but it's not pretty.
It's beautiful, but not pretty. Yeah, that's right. And we can see that. I mean, one of the things that I'm excited about myself in terms of my own development is actually becoming more fully green. You know, I don't want to be colonized, you know, and I don't want it to be exclusive. But I actually feel like there's a lot of territory for me to grow into as best I can, as a practice, not trying to be super successful, but faithful to it. Mm-hmm. See the world through the eyes of people who are different than me.
Absolutely.
You know, and radically different from me. And to see the groups and to see the karmas and to just try on new ideas. I really appreciated the column that David Brooks did a week or so ago about reparations.
Mm-hmm. I saw it, but I didn't actually read it. What did he say?
Yeah. Well, he said, I can't just rule that out anymore. You know, I mean, it's impossible. You know, there's all the arguments against it, but there is something to it. There is something to going the extra mile to help people who have a karmic history. And I didn't even used to believe in a karmic history That's not true. Karmas, I assumed were passed on behaviorally for sure by our grandmother and our, whatever. We get the karmas of our history. But there's also arguments now that I think are, legit, that there's actually even a physical karma that comes down from trauma.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think reparations are highly symbolic, and in the same way that we atone or we ask for forgiveness in terms of our past misdeeds, that doing that on behalf of our ancestors is a highly symbolic act that probably would free a lot of energy.
Yeah.
I think the other part of the conversation from an integral perspective, however, is to also begin to recognize just the tremendous resilience within culture, and also the, again, people will say, being white, particularly in relationship to race, I probably am not positioned well to be arguing for this, but just that, the human spirit, in the case of Black people in our country, the Black church, just being like high, just tremendous, what's the word? Ability to transform and transmute the experience of suffering into just tremendous art in the form of gospel and preaching and community and supporting the downtrodden. I mean, it's just a remarkable story from my perspective. So I would like to also see that in the conversation, not simply the way in which people are victimized, but also how tremendously transformed people have become through this process. It's, again, I think as a white person.
Well, it's a both. Yeah, I know. Here we are, two white people talking about this.
Yeah,
but
we could talk about gender. Maybe we're better off doing that.
Well, yeah. Let me make sure. There was something I was gonna.
Well, you were saying that you really like the part of you that's green. You want to actually include and be very curious about those who are significantly different than you are. Yeah. And I think, and that is one of the crown jewels of green values, or pluralistic values. But I do think we need to recognize that because until we hit second tier, according to this research, we literally cannot hold multiple perspectives.
Right.
So paradoxically, the people that are not like me are like me in my values and my worldview and my way of seeing, and who I can't hold are Trump voters, or who I can't hold are people working for Google, or who I can't hold is Exxon.
Right.
It's like, I'm going to pick and choose who I'm inside of my.
Yeah, you could be any race, creed, color, gender, as long as you agree with me.
Yeah.
But,
Because I think it's actually your integral sensibility that allows you to connect with your could get in trouble, you rednecks.
Well, I grew up with rednecks, no doubt about it. And, it's just one of the things about Integral in general is that I want my full redneckness online too. Mm-hmm. I don't want the redneck. Here's what I've been thinking is that each of these worldviews, of course, from an integral perspective, has a piece of the truth and a piece of gold,
Correct, yeah.
And how do we know what that is? The way I've been thinking about it is that the part that is good is the part that invites everybody to it. Mm-hmm. So even my redneck roots, to the degree that I want to get rid of all the ethnocentric kind of, contractions, but I want to feel into that part of the redneck culture that is simple and
grounded,
loves their family, and loves their country, and feels to the degree that they are religious that the world is enchanted, and that there actually is something beyond just what we could see and touch.
Yeah, so and they know their roles.
I went from there.
They know how to show up for each other. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
They know what they're supposed to do. Yeah.
And so when I talk about green, I want to talk about the green that we move into Integral with. Mm-hmm. Which is that deep sensitivity, but none of the, retribution against people, what my grandfather did to your grandfather. I want to take that into account. I want to take that into account in a way that I didn't used to want to take that into account. And I think that's progress. I think there are a lot of people, myself included, who wanted to move into Integral a little too fast. And there was still some green to, and there still is green to get, to bring forward. But I don't want to bring the exclusivity, that basically just turns the hierarchy on its head and has the victim be the perpetrator.
Yeah, totally.
And there's a lot of that. And it's what you would expect. I mean, it's the way humans do it. But fuck, it's painful.
It's painful.
And,
and you don't get a lot done.
Consternating to a lot of people, but, here we are.
It's tricky business for sure. Yeah. I like that about you. You often remind me that to be amazed in the face of evolution and development and how things are changing for the better. And because I do sometimes get caught in an apocalyptic back eddy. So I appreciate that you kind of bring me out of that.
Yeah, I do too. But yeah, it's good to remember. And I think a lot of people get screwed up here because it's like Jordan Peterson. So somebody talked to me about Jordan Peterson recently. Yeah. I'm going to do an interview about him again later in the week. And one of his arguments is that, you think feminism is a good thing. Look at the relationships between men and women now. The degradation of the harmony in the relationships between men and women. And I'm surprised by that because, first of all, he's a psychologist, and psychologists, we know that they're facing the shadow in one way or the other. However, whatever therapeutic modality you're using, you're basically looking at something you were unwilling to look at and feeling something you were unwilling to feel. And that's cathartic. It's crazy. It's painful, but it gets us somewhere.
And as Fritz Perls says, awareness is curative. So.
Yes, awareness itself is curative. Mm-hmm. And so, and then he talks a lot about the, hero's journey and about myth and the value of myth. Mm-hmm. For God's sake, if myth isn't about walking through the fire, I don't know what is. Mm-hmm.
And I also have to wonder.
So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and I wonder about Jordan Peters, his sample of relationships, because in my experience, with this is anecdotal, but the friends and the colleagues and the people that I work with, I'm actually really impressed by the quality of people's relationships.
Really? That's good to hear.
I really am, and particularly the people that are a generation younger than me and maybe 2 generations younger. It seems like they really seem genuinely respectful of one another. And obviously, what's that old adage that familiarity breeds contempt? There is that problem. Just living with someone is challenging, and doing your whole life thing in the company of someone else has got its own built-in challenges. But I feel like I see a tremendous amount of respect between people. I see understanding for their various roles. I see women recognizing just the pressure on males to produce, to perform, to provide, to take care of the family. I was recently listening to this podcast out of LA called The Big One about earthquake preparation. And every male that they talked about earthquake preparation, the sentence that came out of their mouth is, I have to protect my family. And I didn't hear the women saying that. It's not that they weren't thinking it, but they certainly weren't saying it in the way the males were. And that there's a tremendous amount of pressure to be in that role, and there's isolation in that role. And there's now the experience of feeling that you're just fundamentally wrong and bad. But so this idea that we can actually empathize with one another's predicaments, and again, I'm speaking in cisgendered language between, straight men and women. And obviously there are all kinds of exceptions to that fundamental duality, but that there seems to be a lot of kind of growing up in terms of being able to tolerate and include and negotiate with the differences.
Absolutely.
With our differences, you and I have them. We've been working together for years,
Yes.
And, I tend to want to go towards a problem. You tend to want sleeping dogs to lie, and that's fine.
The room.
Well, you just don't want to waste Press's life force.
I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Yes, totally. And I'm a fighter, not a lover.
Hey, it's all good. Those are 2 sides of the street that both are engines of evolution. Mm-hmm. We fight our way forward, and we, the other F word, our way forward.
Yes, we do both.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anyway, so back to Jordan Peterson. So I listen to his arguments about gender. I listen to him say, which I find fascinating, that creating equality will not create an equal result. Equality of opportunity does not an equal result create, because he says that there's an enormous preferencing of males towards things and women towards people that will always result in fewer female CEOs. And I just think that that's fascinating. He says that basically our formula is wrong. And I think that's interesting. I don't know if he's right. But.
I think he's right in terms of the zeitgeist of the time, but who knows where we go from here?
Yeah, it's
in terms of genders. I mean, if you look at how we are now versus the way our grandparents and great-grandparents were, I mean, who knows where we're going? So, but yeah, I mean, as long as we have the equality of opportunity, and we sort of keep the interiority in mind and online, I think we're going to work our way towards where we're going.
Yeah, well, what choice do we have?
Yeah, exactly.
Of course we're going to get
there. I was sort of shocked by something that I saw a couple days ago at my gym relative to this, especially relative to the younger people. And, everybody's careful in what we say and how we defend and all of that stuff, which is, basically good. We want to be aware of those things. We don't want to be contracted by them, but we want to be aware of them.
Absolutely.
So I'm at the gym, and there's sort of a floor where people are doing floor exercises and so forth. And there's a couple massage tables where, the trainer might massage somebody's leg cramps or whatever. And
I just hope he stops there.
Well, this is the point. This is the point.
I can see it coming.
There was a young woman who was wearing she had a bare midriff. So she had a tank top and she had some sort of leotards or whatever. So she's laying on her back.
Spandex.
Exactly. And she's beautiful.
She's hot.
She's hot. And her trainer, who is young, and they're both in their 20s, so probably mid-20s, maybe even early 20s. And he's massaging her in this deep tissue massage up around her ribs, and just following along the bottom of her breast. And everybody's like doing their exercises as if this wasn't happening. And I'm like, am I the only person who's seeing that this man is, and they're chatting. And, honest to God, Di, it was thrilling in a way to see that people could do that kind of thing and be civilized about it and respectful. And in my generation, you would call the cops, if somebody was doing that in public. So, where we're going with sexuality is hopefully we want more of it. We want a bigger circle of what's available to us.
I'm with you. I think that's massively cool. And I think it's interesting in the S&M community that that in a way they're taking these domination submission structures, which we inherit probably through our chimpanzee
absolutely
DNA, and
chimpanzee bonobo
and bonobo, both sides. Yeah, and they're actually making them object and taking responsibility and creating really, explicit forms around the switching of these roles and whose responsibilities. The rest of us, we're just in domination and submission exchanges all the time without ever noting it.
Exactly.
They're the farthest along when it comes to
They are absolutely the farthest along.
Yeah.
And, that doesn't mean we all have to get into domination and submission, but domination and submission actually creates the energy of sexuality.
The polarity.
It's a polarity. And we don't want to homogenize that too much.
You also said something to me once that I found really interesting and fascinating, because in a certain way, as a gay man, you were considered, and the gay community was considered aberrant, that it freed you up to have whatever dimension of your sex life you wanted, because you weren't trying to be normal from the get-go.
Yeah, so we're already outlaws.
Yeah, so that's really interesting to me. Well, you and I are getting older too. How do you feel with all of this?
Well, I feel excited about the cultural movement towards these explorations of the interiors. And all of our little hurts, our little micro hurts, all our little sensitivities, it's just a matter of, we're all becoming more complex to each other. We're seeing each other more deeply. It's like we're turning the Google map up on each other, and we're seeing into each other in ways that we didn't before.
That's a nice image.
I like that. And I like that with my intimate relationship with Chuck. And, I don't want to get into detail, but we're doing great at 64 and 65. It's just unseemly. We go to each other. That's unseemly how good this is going.
Well, that was the point I was making a few minutes ago about the quality of the relationships I'm seeing.
So actually, I wanted to ask you, Di.
Yeah, sure.
In your experience with you're working in organizations, you're working as a mediator, you're working as a diversity trainer, you got your group of people. What are you seeing out there? Where's the edge?
What I'm seeing is that as I'm seeing a little bit of what Ken's saying, in the sense that I'm seeing these 3 and possibly 4 different cultures really, as he would say, at each other's throats. I'm finding that conversations are difficult to have with the amount of overriding kind of pressure around political correctness. And it's one of the things that I really try to, in my groups and training, try to help move people out of that reactiveness. Because, we talk in Integral about every perspective is true and partial. Is there a perspective? Is there a way to see the partiality of someone's expression and maybe give them a tip about how to say it differently to capture the truth they're trying to get at? But right now what happens is that people do get quite uptight. They get a lot of fight or flight. They feel like they're going to fail. And if they do say something, they're angry. And so really good discussion gets shut down quite a bit in this context of unhealthy green.
God, that sounds like a job for Zen master Diane Musho Hamilton. Jesus.
Well, I mean, I have the benefit of an integral map, and so I can see that the mean, green, intolerant meme that's so full of tolerance that it's dogmatic at every turn. I see how that has to be tempered, and that we have to, sort of back up from that and let people still have an environment of being able to express themselves so we can get at these true and partial truths. I tell a story about, in one of my chapters in the book that I'm working on, by the way, with Gabe Wilson and Kimberly Lowe, who are both colleagues and students of mine, who Gabe is Black and Kim is actually Chinese, although she grew up in the UK. So she's kind of a multicultural person, and we're comparing notes and all these kinds of things. But we were at an event in Berkeley, and I think this is a couple of years ago now, and it was a huge array of Berkeley's probably one of the beating hearts, if there are multiple hearts, at least the beating heart of American liberalism, so we just had this massive cross-section of people. And at one point during the very early stages of the program, we did a small group discussion, and people introduced themselves, and we asked for preferred gender pronouns. I know people argue with the word preferred now. But there was one young man who was about 18 who basically introduced himself as a Black woman.
Ironically, or not ironically?
Not ironically.
Oh.
Not ironically, which led to a very rich and interesting discussion. And luckily, there were two women in the circle who were both Black, one younger, one older. So I turned it over to them, and they were just awesome. I mean, they were so genuine and so straightforward. And just basically, the young one, I think I recall, told him basically, you're not a Black woman because you would know better than to say something just that crazy, number one. And the older woman was just said, like, you need to understand, it's been so recent that we've, as women, particularly in Black women, even been able to have a voice, that as a young white male to hear you say that is not only confusing, but I also do have the experience that in some way that you're still denying me my voice. Like, it's not cool. And then he went to kind of, reinterpret what he meant, that he felt on the inside like a Black woman. And I said, what I think would be helpful here is maybe rather than asserting what you were trying to do, why don't you just reflect what you heard them say? And so he stopped, and he actually, with both of them, just repeated what he'd heard them say. And in that process of listening and repeating, his whole demeanor changed. He became open, he became vulnerable, he sort of got the lesson. And it was just like an amazing thing how, not to just see him as terrible and wrong right out of the chute, but to see there's something he's trying to get at. And then once he listened, then I was able to turn to him and say, it seems like you're trying to either empathize or create a connection, and there's something positive in what you're trying to do. But do you feel how much more connected you are now that you listened, as opposed to asserting something that, from an empirical point of view, just simply isn't true? And he was really able to receive the lesson. And so, sometimes things go in the right direction. Evolution actually works.
Yeah.
In some cases.
Well, that's a terrific example because it gets to the, in a sense, the simplicity of it, which is to just, let's see each other, And then
he did it. He did it. It was great. Yeah. It was great.
And there was a connection that with the black ladies were part of too.
Yeah. I mean, they really had no interest in making him bad and wrong, but they were interested in schooling him.
Yeah.
For sure. And did.
Yeah.
And, but no, I think when he listened, then they were able to, in some way, open to him and then to look deeper into what his motive was.
Yeah.
That he also feels his voice isn't heard at times. Yeah. He also feels unseen.
Yeah.
In ways. And, you can't make the comparison.
Yeah.
It's not, it's a lofty comparison, but still there was something he was trying to do that wasn't bad.
Yeah. Well, we're all trying to be seen.
Right.
I mean, and as we should be. I mean, if we look at evolution, it's basically, creating more complexity, creating more diversity. That is the nature of evolution. Yes. And there's so much more to each of us than we are actually able at this stage to communicate to each other.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why in our work, and I formed this program, the Integral Facilitator, with Rebecca Colwell and 10 Directions, and they also do other training programs. But we talk about how evolution evolves through this relationship of sameness and difference, just like what you're just saying, and that even the brain will create new neural pathways that are brand new when we have different experiences, and that then the way that it evolves is to eventually integrate those neural pathways. So it's harmonized and unified, and then these new experiences happen and create new pathways in the brain, and that's literally how evolution happens. So your interest in including those people who are different than you is exactly what evolution is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Flowering of differentiation that is then integrated.
Yep. Yeah. Right? Well, it reminds me of something that my root meditation teacher Shinzen Young used to say, and that is the best way to get from point A to point B is to be fully at point A. And that the way when we talk about moving into it, what an integral relationship to diversity, or what it is to be beyond green, one of the ways there is to be fully green.
Yes.
And actually fully modern, fully traditional. There's, and this is a practice, this is an ideal, but that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
That's
what we're trying to do. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything that you're doing that people might want to check out if they're interested?
Basically, what we're trying to do is just put forward the idea that conversation, Ken always says thoughts are things. We need to take conversations seriously, because when we have conversations, we're literally rehearsing possibilities for our reality.
Absolutely.
He says we think about things for 100, 200 years before they ever come into being. And one of the ways we think is by talking together.
Yeah.
And so our conversations are really important.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining me, Di.
We'll
see you next time. Jeff. Thank you, everybody.
Right. Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
You have been